Good morning. It's so good to see you here to celebrate the arts, to talk about books, and to be together, especially now at this time. This program is co-sponsored by Addis Israel of Washington, D.C., and Congregation Beth El of Montgomery County, Maryland. I'm Robin Jacobson, the Library and Literary Director at Addis Israel. At Beth El, I lead the book club along with the wonderful Marge London, who's co-hosting this program. We're happy to see all of you, whether you're from the sponsoring synagogues or the wider community of readers. You are all so very, very welcome. This is our kickoff event for a Meet the Author Zoom series. Today, we are thrilled to have Boris Fishman with us to talk about his memoir on his immigrant experience, Savage Feast, 3 Generations, 2 Continents, and a Dinner Table. As far as our upcoming Meet the Author visits and literary events, if you are on our email list, you will automatically receive information about them. If you are not on our email list and would like to be, please email me at librarian@addisisrael.org. And now Marge London will introduce our distinguished author guest.
Okay, there are a lot of wonderful things to say about Boris Fishman, but here's a quick overview. Boris Fishman was born in Minsk, Belarus, and immigrated to the United States with his family in 1988 when he was 9 years old. The family lived in Brooklyn, but later moved to New Jersey, where Boris attended Princeton University and majored in Russian literature. He later earned an MFA in fiction from NYU. His articles and essays have appeared in many prestigious publications, including The New Yorker, the New York Times Magazine and Book Review, the London Review of Books, the Wall Street Journal, the New Republic, and others. Of special interest to us inside the Beltway types, he edited and wrote the introduction for the Senate's report on Hurricane Katrina. Boris is also a teacher. He has taught creative writing at Princeton University and other institutions. Savage Feast is Boris's 3rd book. His 2 previous books were novels, A Replacement Life and Don't Let My Baby Do Rodeo, both New York Times notable books of the year. His books have won impressive awards and collected many, many rave reviews from prominent publications. It is an honor to welcome him.
Absolutely nothing to add. It was very generous. So I thought I would just talk a little bit about where this book comes from, and then we can move to a conversation together, which I feel is always more fun. So I was thinking about it. I think Savage Feast, probably like all books written by all authors, had its beginnings when I was just a child in the Soviet Union. And even though I was just a wee lad, I was old enough to find it so strange that, in the Soviet Union, sometimes it was quite difficult to find food, to find ingredients, to find high quality ingredients. And so my family, like everyone's family, spent a lot of time hunting for the things that would make up our meals. And then my grandmother spent hours cooking these meals. But then when it came time to eat, everyone swooped down on this table and devoured the things that were on it in a matter of minutes. And for me, that imbalance was very strange. As a 6-year-old, you can't quite put words to it, but you notice it in your own back of the mind kind of way. And the other thing that was noticeable to me was my grandmother had such a strange relationship to food. This will not surprise any of you. She always put too much on the plate, and she became very, very, very upset. Not just very upset, very, very, very upset if you didn't finish, right? It wasn't, by this point, in America, generations later, when all of us have had plenty for a very long time, it's kind of a fun joke, the grandma who won't let you stop eating, right? But in the Soviet Union, AIDS after the war, I mean, her face was consumed by anguish. And so I knew that if I didn't want to upset my grandmother, I had to keep going. But what if you can't keep going? So I had to resort to tricks. I'd wait till my grandmother left the room, and then I'd tiptoe to the window. We lived on the second floor, and like I would just scoop out my oatmeal. There was this bush directly underneath our window. It was the oatmeal bush, and whenever I got too much oatmeal, which was every time, I scooped it out there. We had these funny little footstools. The tops opened up. And so when my grandmother left the room, whatever it was, the eggs on my plate, I opened up the top of the footstool and I just scooped it into the footstool and closed it. Now, surely that was discovered at some point. Nobody ever said a word. We come from a culture where people don't talk about certain things. I don't know how that was resolved by the adults, but these are some of the things that happen. And again, food is like a secondary thing in life. I was too young to understand how important it was. It's just sort of something that stayed in the back of my mind. And I didn't really begin to understand the reasons for all this behavior until I would say more than a decade later. We immigrated to the States. And as some of you may know, um, behind the Iron Curtain, we were not eligible to apply for restitution from the German government for suffering during the Holocaust. And my grandmother was a Holocaust survivor. But here it became possible. And I had the best English in my family by virtue of being the kid. And she and I sat down and I basically interviewed her about what she went through so that I could fill out the paperwork. Now, these are stories that my grandmother was never willing to share, right? Whenever we got near the subject of the war at home, at the dinner table, at the breakfast table, at the lunch table, everybody carefully steered away. If you wanted to, if you wanted to avoid upsetting your grandmother, eat your food. If you wanted to avoid anguishing your grandmother, don't talk about the war. But now she had no choice. She had to tell me what she went through in order to receive restitution. And in this process, I began to understand some of the reasons why she was like this. Um, we're from Minsk, which is a town some of you may know, some of you may have family from near there. Minsk was the largest westernmost Soviet city. It was the first major city invaded by the Germans in June 1941. And my grandfather's family, they owned horses. And because of that, they were able to load up a cart and get out of town before the Germans came in. My grandmother's family did not have that opportunity. And so um, they were captured and herded, incarcerated in the ghetto that was formed in Minsk in July 1941. It had 100,000 inmates, so to speak. Um, and my grandmother's sister, when you were in the ghetto, it wasn't it wasn't a concentration camp. The boundaries were porous. And so in the mornings, work details were marched out to perform work for the Germans and then returned at night. And during one of these marches, my grandmother's sister managed to slip away and join, I'm sure some of you know the partisans. These are the anti-guerrilla units that were operating in the forest. Join one of these units. Um, but for a variety of reasons, one of which was it's very dangerous. Another reason was that a lot of these anti-guerrilla units, I mean, they were anti-Nazi, but that doesn't mean they were pro-Jewish. Many of them refused to take in Jewish escapees from the ghetto. So it was more than 2 years before my grandmother managed to do the same. In September 1943, she was sort of slated to do the same thing. The necessary arrangements had been made. There would be a person waiting here to ferry you there, and then, a Confederate with a truck would take you there. Um, my grandmother's parents and her grandfather were supposed to try to leave with her. But shortly before this was supposed to happen, my great-grandfather became ill, and her parents decided that they would have to stay because they wouldn't leave him there. He pleaded with them to leave him. They wouldn't leave him. It was a difficult moment for all of them. Eventually, it was decided that she would go alone, and she succeeded. She managed to escape. Um, but what she encountered in the woods though it was a kind of freedom. When it came to food, it was even more impoverished than what she had to endure in the ghetto. Basically, for 10 months, she had to survive on berries and sucking on tree bark and potato peels. And it was just perennial hunger for 10 months. And this was long enough to make her crazy, crazy on the subject of food. She spent the rest of her life, she lived for another 65 years. And for the remaining, I'm sorry, 55 years. And for the remaining 55 years, she was absolutely neurotic and psychotic on the subject of food. When she saw her first loaf of bread after the war, my grandmother was a very decorous, proper woman. You would never see her ever do anything um, that wasn't well mannered, that was unseemly. She leapt on that loaf like an animal. It was a tiny little loaf because flour was scarce, and she devoured the entire loaf in one go. And then she vomited all of it out because after 10 months of intense hunger, her system couldn't handle it. And sort of bread became the metaphor of her privation. The only job she was willing to take after the war was at a bread factory. She needed to work at a bread factory. She lost her entire family because the Minsk ghetto underwent periodic pogroms. And three had already taken place by the time that my grandmother escaped. The fourth and final one, though no one knew it, took place in October 1943, the month after she escaped, and her parents and her grandfather were murdered. She'd already lost her great-grandmother at the beginning of the war because when the Germans were coming in, she had unpleasant recollections of World War I, and she decided that she would not go to the ghetto. She would not let them take her, and she stuffed herself behind the furnace they had inside the house to heat the house and cook their own food, and suffocated herself. So this is how my grandmother lost her entire family. So when my grandmother and her sister, who also survived, came back to their former home before the war, it was occupied by a Belarusian who had collaborated with the Germans. And he begrudgingly gave them a corner of the house that they could inhabit. Can you imagine? And he continued to live on the other side. Can you imagine sharing your childhood home, having lost your entire family, with a man who had betrayed people like you and continued to prosper after the war? One day, my grandmother and her sister, they were out, and he crept into their corner and stole all the clothes that they'd gotten from the Red Cross and pawned it on the black market. They had one dress apiece between the two of them. I mention all of this just as context. This was not a situation that encouraged a person to be choosy about where they found their support. But she refused to work anywhere but that bread factory, and she was nuts about bread for the rest of her life. I remember as a boy, there always had to be 4 or 5 loaves of bread at the house at the same time. That's what you needed. And as soon as one of these loaves went stale, off it went into the trash. This was inconceivable in a Soviet environment. If anything started going bad, you made something else out of it, right? Soviet housewives were some of the most resourceful people in the world. You made breadcrumbs, you made stuffing. You didn't buy 5 loaves to begin with because clearly one of them would go stale before you got to use it, right? But it wasn't about utility. It was about something else that was up here. My grandmother and her sister, I think they arrived at very different conclusions after the war. Not that either of them could articulate it, not that either of them could understand it, I think. I think people react to intense trauma in very different ways. My grandmother's sister, it made her extremely frugal, extremely cautious, extremely reserved. She was basically hoarding, saving, protecting, waiting, right? It was a way of survival that sort of had at its center, you're basically You're just waiting for the next installment of the trauma to arrive. There's another kind of response to trauma where you react the opposite way. And you say to yourself, I'm going to live extravagantly, as if that tomorrow will never come, as if that next installment of the trauma will not arrive. And my grandmother was of this latter type. And she married a man, my grandfather, who was incredibly adept at navigating the black market in the Soviet Union. He was a man who could bring you 100 loaves of black bread, if that's what you wanted. He could get you anything you wanted. You wanted gold, which was possession of which was illegal by individuals in the Soviet Union, he could bring you gold. You wanted a vacation voucher, which were dispensed by the government and hard to come by, he could get you a vacation voucher. You needed access to a good pediatrician who would visit, pediatricians gave house calls. So you want a pediatrician who will visit your house first, he'll get you that pediatrician. You'll need to give him something back, but that was the arrangement. And it won't surprise you to hear that sort of during my childhood, my grandmother owned the kitchen. Nobody could come inside the kitchen. That was her domain. My grandfather procured the things that were very hard to procure, and she made magic out of them. And she, one of my favorite recipes in Savage Feast, I have two favorite recipes in that book, and one of them is the kind of stuffed cabbage that she made. She made stuffed cabbage, which is a dish I'm sure all of you know, in a way I'd never heard of before or since. She braised her stuffed cabbage in a combination of torn up sourdough rye bread and sour cherry jam, which is a recipe that she invented herself. And once I became a cook and began thinking about it, it began to make sense to me as a kind of Soviet variation on tomato paste and brown sugar. It's some of the same flavors, but we didn't have tomato paste in the Soviet Union. We didn't have brown sugar in the Soviet Union. And this was sort of the set of variations that she arrived at. Do any of you know what Helzel is? I'm excited because I'm actually talking to some people who've heard of it. So Helzel is chicken necks stuffed with caramelized onions, fried in flour, schmaltz, other things. She made that. One of her favorite things in the world was when you're making jam, sort of the froth that comes up at the top. She loved scooping off that froth and piling it onto a huge hunk of white bread, always bread, lathered with about a finger's worth of butter, and eating that with with hot black tea. She was an incredibly severe and strict woman, but when it came to food, it was her ultimate weakness. We shared a balcony in our apartment, which we lived in our apartment with my grandparents, with a next door neighbor who was a complete alcoholic and a drunk. And typically my grandmother would be extremely judgmental of such a person. But he lived alone. His wife had divorced him. She had taken the kids, and he didn't know how to cook. And this one fact made him a surrogate son for her. And so he was constantly stumbling over on the balcony, the kind of person that we always fled from in the opposite direction. And we had these windows where there was like the window, and then there was like a tiny little opening in the window, and she would feed him food through that window. And so I'd sometimes sort of peek into the kitchen just because these smells, they were all over the house, and you just couldn't wait. When will it finally be ready? And so sometimes I would sneak a peek into the kitchen, and I'd see her passing along food to him through the little window. And so this is how we lived. In the Soviet Union, food was currency, right? If my mom was a valedictorian in high school, right? But because she was Jewish, Jews were seen as suspect for all the reasons that you know in the Soviet Union. So, for example, just by virtue of the fact that she was Jewish, she was demoted to second place in her high school, right? And my grandfather approached the principal of the high school and without referring to what had happened at all, said, we're so grateful to you. You've provided our daughter with such an amazing education. We just wanted to thank you. We're wondering if you would come over and just have a meal at our table. Now, that person, if they knew anything about my grandfather, but even if they didn't, right, this was code for, come on over, we'll ply you with things that you would not have access to on the open market. Even the principal of a high school, which was a fairly elevated position, right? And then you make your own conclusions about the right way to repay us. And this person came, he ate food that he did not have any access to otherwise. He drank alcohol that he did not have access to otherwise, things that usually political VIPs only had access to for the most part. Not a word was shared about my mother's experience. But when it was all said and done, guess what? She was returned to her valedictorian position. This is how things worked in the Soviet Union. When my grandparents wanted something, right? When they needed to bribe somebody, when they needed to right the imbalance caused by anti-Semitic discrimination in the Soviet Union, they just invited somebody to their table. You didn't slip money into people's hands, though you could do that too. You just invited them to your table. When we immigrated, my grandmother had never been, none of us had ever been outside the Soviet Union. Travel outside the Soviet Union was very, very complicated. You needed all kinds of permission and assurances. And as a Jew, your loyalties were suspect. And so you were never released, especially for those reasons. But finally, we received permission to immigrate. And as some of you may know, there were these diplomatic way stations you had to go through in order to have your paperwork processed before arriving in America. And the first one was Vienna. And all of us were just like so crazy with the intensity and the drama and the trauma of immigration and leaving our lives behind, right? We were told that we could pack one suitcase per person. There were 5 of us, my maternal grandparents, my parents, and myself. Can you imagine trying to pack a century's worth of family life into 5 suitcases? We could take out 90 rubles worth of value per person, right? My mother's wedding ring alone was worth more than 90 rubles, and she had to leave it behind. So none of us thought about the fact that the first place that we were going to was a place where they speak the language that was spoken by the people who had murdered my grandmother's family. And she heard that little bit of Austrian German, and she did not emerge from the hotel where they put us up for the 3 weeks that we were in Vienna. Not once. There were all sorts of mandatory things. We had to do medical checkups. We had to visit a synagogue because we were being sponsored by a Jewish organization. It was the least we could do to say thank you, to go to the synagogue and see how people worship freely. None of us felt we had the authority to say no, right? We were good Soviet citizens. When the authority in charge of whatever it is that we were going through told us to go to the synagogue, we went to the synagogue. My grandmother said, I'm not going anywhere. Also, she had not been separated from her sister for 43 years. The last time she'd been separated from her was during the war. And I think psychologically, they were very different, but it didn't matter. You have no idea how many times I snuck a peek into our kitchen, and there the 2 of them were seated next to each other, phenomenally different women. Sisters by blood, but so different, and just whispering to each other about something. And she had to give that up. And I think it was an incredible recreation of the trauma that she had experienced during the war. And her only salve was in that kitchen. She cooked for 3 weeks like a fiend. It was enough to feed the whole city of Vienna, right? Like, we got a stipend, and we finally encountered the bounty of Western supermarkets. It made us crazy. We'd never seen anything like it. You didn't have to compete. You didn't have to know anybody. You just paid the money and they gave it to you. And insanely, they had grapes in winter. They had strawberries in winter. They had things like pineapples and bananas and tangerines, which, we got tangerines once a year for New Year's. That's when they were available. And so just food continued to it just continued to be her sanctuary and salvation. Um, Once we got to America, we learned, um, soon after we got to America, we learned that my grandmother was terminally ill. And it was a kind of final bequest of our lives in the Soviet Union. And what I mean by that is that in the 1970s, she and my grandfather had been in a car accident. Um, and she had needed I'm sorry, I'm mixing up stories. They had been in a car accident, but this particular, she needed a gallbladder, her gallbladder removed. Um, and as part of the gallbladder operation, she had needed a blood transfusion. And the blood that she got was infected with cirrhosis. And cirrhosis is a terrible, terrible wasting disease that she did nothing to earn. She was not really even a drinker. And very slowly, it killed her in America. American medical care prolonged her life, even though all it prolonged was her suffering. But eventually she passed. One of the things that I learned belatedly, because after I had this experience with my grandmother interviewing her for her restitution paperwork, I became interested in a way I'd never been before, interested to learn my family's history. And I started trying to pin my grandfather down. I started trying to pin my parents down, right? In Soviet families, perhaps like many families, people don't talk. They don't talk about the bad things. They don't talk about the complicated things. They don't talk about the unseemly things. Um, Everything is sort of airbrushed, so that people can feel good, I guess, about what they're a part of. But they brought me to America, which is a very different culture, right? Like in the Soviet Union, it was better not to know. But America taught me that it was better to know, right? Knowing helped you make sense of where you came from, and it helped you sort of see where you wanted to go. It was a culture of disclosure and confession and commemoration, not the opposite. Um, my grandfather was even more reluctant to talk than my grandmother, because for my grandmother it was just traumatic. For my grandfather, it was something else. He got up to a lot of shady things. My grandmother really wanted me to become somebody other than that. They brought me to a country where hopefully I wouldn't have to resort to those things in order to become a full-fledged human being. And so she basically forbade him from ever telling me what he got up to. He was dying to tell me because he wanted to brag. He wanted me to see just how resourceful he was, just how brave he was, just what a man he was. And of course, he wanted me to be as resourceful, brave, and manly as he was. But she forbade him. And especially after she died, it was a kind of belated tribute to her for him to refuse to tell me any of it. But I found my own ways of wearing him down. And one of the things I learned was that when my grandfather learned that my grandmother needed a gallbladder operation, out of an excess of love and care, but also it was a kind of tick at this point, he figured out who the operating surgeon was, and he figured out what his address was, and he showed up at his doorstep the night before the operation bearing gifts in order to make sure that this man would take the right kind of care with his wife. But the only kind of gift that my grandfather knew anything about was alcohol, Armenian cognac. He brought with him 3 bottles of Armenian cognac. Now, for this gentleman, it would be extremely rude not to say, "How generous, why don't you come in and we pop one open?" But these being Soviet men, they didn't know how to stop at 1 bottle, and so they just kept going, and they consumed most of the alcohol that my grandfather had bought, which meant that the next morning when it came time to operate, the surgeon was still drunk. And I've often wondered whether that had anything to do with the fact that my grandmother required a blood transfusion and the fact that she got a bad blood transfusion. And so in a roundabout way, right, did this life under the table sort of eventually declare a kind of belated cost by claiming my grandmother's life. Um, and my grandmother's death disoriented us in many ways, uh, needless to say. Um, but one of them, a central one, was that the kitchen went empty. Suddenly the kitchen was empty, and people had been kept from it for so long. Nobody knew um, who was supposed to go in there now and do what in it. Also, this very strange thing had happened in America where my grandfather never forgave us for this. But in America, the generations don't live together. The generations find their own homes. And whereas the three generations had lived together in Minsk, now I was living in Manhattan. My parents had moved out to the suburbs in New Jersey, and my grandfather suddenly was alone in Brooklyn. Um, I'm sort of going beyond my time limit here, so I will relay this part of the story very quickly, but I hope you'll bear with me because it is an important part of the story. Um, through machinations that I'll skip here, but I would be happy to discuss during the Q&A, um, my grandfather conned his way into 24-hour home aid care from the city of New York. My grandmother had 24-hour care because she was terminally ill. He was unqualified for the same, but he used some of the same tricks that had helped him so much in the Soviet Union to secure the same for himself. But this sort of original conceptual sin brought into his life an incredible woman named Oksana. Oksana was from Western Ukraine. And the great luck of that fact was my grandfather had never left the Soviet Union despite 30 years in the United States. He settled in South Brooklyn. He watched Russian television. He read Russian newspapers. He ate Russian food. He didn't learn English. He went to Russian doctors. When he had problems, my mother solved them, right? He continued to live in a Soviet Union of the mind. Oksana came from Western Ukraine, which even in 2004, when she left, had not changed that much from what it had been in Soviet times. The way people related to each other, what was available on the shelves, what you could stand to earn, more than anything, just the mentality that obtained in the place. And so in this way, they were made for each other. They came from the same place. They were up for the same cons. If I had more time, I would tell you about the things that they got up to in South Brooklyn. One of them, for example, is they became a bank in their building. They would lend money out to people at interest. Um, they had schemes with the pharmacy. They had schemes with the Turkish dried goods grocer. Sometimes I would try to figure out what they were up to, and even I couldn't make sense of it. They ate the same things. They watched the same things. They took the same walks. Their connection was never romantic, but it didn't have to be. My grandfather had just lost the woman he'd lived alongside for 55 years, and Oksana left behind her entire family in Ukraine. And not only did she leave behind her entire family, Oksana had this particular kind of ill luck that prevented her from ever being able to find the kind of life partner that she always really wanted. Oksana's, in her view, Oksana's great liability was that she was incredibly smart, incredibly productive, incredibly efficient, incredibly creative, incredibly resourceful. And her misfortune in life was to always meet men who were the opposite. And all she ever wanted was to meet a man who was strong and resolute and would make some of the decisions that always fell to her. I think some of us might regard this as a kind of retrograde desire, but feminism worked very, very differently in the Soviet Union. And that's another interesting subject that perhaps we could discuss. So by this point, Oksana had given up on trying to find a kind of male life partner. And then she encountered my grandfather, who was as resourceful, as creative, as chivalrous as she had always wanted her partner to be. And again, it was never romantic, but I know that she cherished the way that he treated her and the way that he regarded her and the way that he interacted with her. And just to finish the story, there's no doubt in my mind that she kept him alive. For the 13 years that he stayed alive after my grandmother passed, it was entirely thanks to her. She was his oxygen and she was his blood, not us. Not us. And as greatly as we mourned his death when he finally passed, she mourned it even more. She hasn't been the same person since he passed in December 2017. But But the last thing I want to say is that I was very grateful that Oksana was helping my grandfather because it meant I was off the hook. And the reason that I wanted to be off the hook is because after very many years of being the person who translated, the person who did things on behalf of my family, the person who sort of carried them on their shoulders and saved them from having to deal with this America that they had brought me to without my asking, I was drifting very hard, both from my family and my culture, around the time that Oksana showed up in my grandfather's life. Um, you know, there's a lot of talk about what sort of the good things that immigration does for the country that the immigrants come to, for the immigrating family, the American dream, and all that. I feel like there isn't enough talk about the sort of the destructive consequences for the bonds between the family. The children and the elders become foreigners to each other. You know, my parents brought me to a country where they wanted me to take advantage of everything that America had, um, for everything that I could now take advantage of, despite being Jewish. But they wanted me to remain a good Soviet boy who never took any risks, who chose one of the three professions that was available to Jews in the Soviet Union, who continued to speak to his mother 10 times a day, right? They somehow wanted me to take only this stuff, but not this stuff. Even that was impossible because these two things were connected. And so I just became very tired of trying to explain to them the different kind of person I was becoming. And the way that they were also polluted for me so much about the culture that I'd come from, right? I just wanted to be American and leave all of that behind. And I was really starting to succeed in this project when Oksana came into my grandfather's life. And Oksana was such a phenomenal cook. And she cooked things that were so very different from my grandmother because she came from Western Ukraine, which is a very different place than Belarus. Belarus is in the north. We've got rye. Down in southwestern Ukraine, they have wheat, they have watermelons, they have pumpkins, they have eggplant, they have all sorts of things that we'd never seen in Belarus. And she just made plain magic from them. She was just one of these people, right? If somebody shows up unannounced, not that a Soviet person would ever allow themselves to show up unannounced, there was enough food on the table for a dozen people within 30 minutes. And to put it very simply, the food was so good that I started going down to South Brooklyn again. And it wasn't only that the food was good. While we ate, I mean, this will never change. It still just takes us about 7 minutes to eat an enormous table's worth of food. But for those 7 minutes, not only were we quiet, not only were we suddenly at peace with each other, we were happy. We found points of connection. We found things to celebrate together. We found all of it lubricated by copious quantities of vodka, of course, but this was an opportunity to recapture some of those bonds that had been getting frayed for quite a while. And with time, I became so grateful to Oksana for this gift that went beyond anything she did for my grandfather. I became so interested in her nuances and subtleties as a person that I asked her if I could learn a bit about her cooking, um, learn about Ukrainian food. And that in turn made me interested in learning now that, you know, my grandmother was no longer there to ask, but my parents still remembered some of the things that my grandmother made, right? Then I embarked on a kind of excavation project for of my grandmother's recipes. And little by little, all of that became Savage Feast, which for me ultimately is less about food than it is about these two quote unquote ordinary women who um, um, are the kinds of people that not many books get written about, except I can't think of many people uh, uh, who could be perfectly famous, who could be more extraordinary than these two individuals. And so for me, Savage Feast ultimately is a kind of celebration of the quiet magnificence of these two, both very typical and extremely unusual, for me, very original, very important women. Thank you.
Thank you, Boris. That was illuminating and poignant and captivating. You are a wonderful storyteller. We appreciate this behind-the-scenes look at Savage Feast. I've heard you say in interviews that writing for you is a way to explore alternative lives. Many of us in this audience have ancestors who came from Tsarist Russia or the former Soviet Union, but emigrated before you and your family did. For us, your book is an alternative history of the way our lives might have unfolded. For readers who haven't started Savage Feast yet, you have a treat in store. And after Savage Feast, you may want to read Boris's other books, A Replacement Life and Don't Let My Baby Do Rodeo. Thank you so much, Boris, and thanks to all of you for coming. Till next time.